Listen for a moment last and hear me tell my tale. How o'er the seas from England's shore I was condemned to sail. The jury found me guilty, sir, and said the judge, said he, for life, Jim Jones, I sentence you across the stormy sea.
Welcome once again to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. Mel Woodford's continuing series, Felonious Females, provides a rich history of the lives of some of the convict women who were sent north to Newcastle and the Hunter Valley in the 1800s. In this episode, Mel tells the story of Margaret McGreavy, a pioneer of Newcastle's East End.
Early Newcastle provided a good opportunity for some female convicts to become businesswomen in their own right and build strong foundations for their families in future generations. Margaret McGreavy was one such woman. Margaret Tynan was born in Waterford, Ireland, around 1797. In 1815, at the age of 18, she married James McGreavy from Roscommon, and before long their daughter Mary Ann was born. Sadly, their wedded bliss did not last for very long. In 1816, James, formerly a soldier, was convicted of burglary and felony at the Kilkenny Spring Assizes and sentenced to 7 years' transportation. It was to be his grave misfortune that he was amongst those 200 unfortunate men who sailed from Cork aboard the Chapman in March of 1817. The voyage of the Chapman I went down in history as one of the most notorious journeys of the convict era and was termed the Hell Ship. It was fortunate indeed that Margaret could not have known the fate of many of those men aboard until she was reunited with her husband some 16+ months later. Margaret had followed James to Cork and found work as a fruit seller until her own arrest and conviction in August 1817 for stealing. A sentence of 7 years' transportation was handed down. We will never know if it was Margaret's intent to follow James to New South Wales or whether she was just unfortunate to be apprehended. Margaret and Mary Ann were destined to sail aboard the Elizabeth I on the 26th of July 1818 from Cork Harbour. Some of the prisoners had been on board the Elizabeth since much earlier in July and were well acquainted with the daily regular routine. They had been permitted to keep their own clothing, but it had been inspected closely to ensure it was clean and not likely to be carrying disease. As the time neared for the departure, some of the women, accompanied by their children, were fearful that they would not be allowed to remain with them. Mr. Oster, the master, inspected the children, and 3 of the older boys, who were around 12 years of age, were sent back to shore as they would be able to work and earn their living. The other 17 younger children, 6 boys and 11 girls, were allowed to remain with their mothers, many being little more than infants. And so, on the 26th of July at 6 a.m. in the morning, with a light breeze and fair conditions, the ship set sail with 101 prisoners, 17 children, and 2 passengers. 2 days into the voyage, the ship's motion caused considerable seasickness amongst the children and the women, but fortunately this only lasted for a day or 2. It was a reasonably uneventful voyage, with no deaths or serious illness recorded in the surgeon's journal, which is available to read online. The female convicts and children arrived in good condition on the 19th of November. There had been some small amount of bickering between the prisoners from Dublin and Cork, but the surgeon, William Hamilton, considered the prisoners caused him much less concern than the first mate, who constantly did his best to ignore the surgeon's orders throughout the journey. The Sydney Gazette and New South Wales Advertiser of Saturday 21st of November 1818 announced the safe arrival of the ship. Once the women had been examined and a muster carried out, many were sent by river to Parramatta Female Factory, including those with small children, and some were quickly assigned to individuals and families as domestic servants. The following year, we find 8 of the women who arrived on the Elizabeth in Newcastle jail at various times. Margaret and James were to find their way there in 1821, after they were tried at the Criminal Court in Sydney and convicted in late July of receiving stolen goods. A considerable quantity of stolen goods by all accounts, mostly clothing. It appears from the testimony at the hearing that James may not have known much about Margaret's unlawful activities, but due to beliefs of the day, a wife acted under the control of her husband, and so both received a colonial sentence of a further 14 years. James arrived in Newcastle on board the Elizabeth Henrietta on the 9th of August 1821, followed by Margaret and Mary Ann aboard the Mermaid on the 22nd. The 1822 muster, taken in September, shows a Margaret McGreavy and a James McGreavy in government employment. Frequent misspellings of their names can be found throughout the many primary sources which are available on the McGreavys. An incident occurred in November 1822 where an alleged rape took place on Mary Ann, and in February 1823 we find the McGreavys moved to Port Macquarie. Margaret had the dubious distinction of being one of the first female convicts to be sent to Port Macquarie. It was here that 3 more children were born to Margaret and James, 3 boys, all dying in infancy. They were to have no more children. It seems Margaret was never far from the watchful eye of the authorities, which provides us with a good deal of documentation. In 1829, she escaped from the Port Macquarie Female Factory by using a ladder to scale the wall and enlisting the aid of the local constable to get her back in again. She appeared before the local bench and was sentenced to a bread and water diet after first having her head shaved. The constable was dismissed. Life took its course for a while after that, until at the age of 15, Mary Ann and an Irish ticket of leave man in his early 40s by the name of John Nixon Brunker posted their bans. Objections to the marriage were soon raised by a Jamaican convict by the name of William Wright, who threatened Brunker, saying that Mary Ann had been promised to him. Some suggestion has been made that Wright may have been the victim of some form of ongoing practical joke amongst some of the other convict men, according to evidence given at the time. The matter was heard before the bench in Port Macquarie, and Wright was charged with impropriety of conduct and punished. Mary Ann and John Brunker went on to marry on the 22nd of September 1830. 3 children were soon born to them. The first, James Nixon Brunker, in 1832, followed by Margaret 2 years later, and Mary Ann in 1836. The following year, John met with an accident whilst crossing Cockfighters Creek, also known as Wallumbye Brook. Sadly, he was drowned. Only 7 years into her marriage, Mary Ann was left a widow with 3 small children at the age of only 23. Her parents, Margaret and James, were there to help. Margaret and James returned to Newcastle in 1833, James had been a commendable convict while in the Port Macquarie area and attained his certificate of freedom early. Margaret served the remainder of her sentence assigned to her daughter, Mary Ann, in Newcastle. James took up the publican's licence of the Star and Garter Inn, which was in Watt Street, in the area between what is now Hunter and King Streets. Soon afterwards, he became the licensee of the Queen Victoria Inn, also located in Watt Street. Again, we find Margaret embroiled in a court case in August 1835, where Mary Ann's domestic servant was accused of mistreating baby Margaret on 3 different occasions. The servant was sentenced to 14 days in the cell and removed from the McGreavy Brunker household. The McGreavys and Brunkers continue to be mentioned in the local newspapers and court records, leaving a well-documented trail for historians to follow. The family stood together through many troubling times. Mary Ann married a Watt Street butcher by the name of William White in 1847 and had 3 more children, all male. William Henry was born in 1849, George 2 years later, and Edward in 1854. After James's death in 1846, the licence of the Queen Victoria Inn passed to Margaret, who held it for the next 12 years. During this period, Margaret helped her family through difficult times. The early and sudden death of her much-loved granddaughter and great-granddaughter, business troubles and robberies. She lived to see her 6 grandchildren born and raised, as well as some of her great-grandchildren from Mary Ann's first marriage. Her first grandchild, James Nixon Brunker, received an excellent education due to the financial support received from James and Margaret. He went on to become a Member of Parliament in 1880, Minister for Lands in 1888, and the Colonial Secretary in 1894. The family name is remembered in place names such as Brunkerville and Brunker Road in the Newcastle area. As well as the 10 great-grandchildren from James and his wife, Margaret also had 20 great-grandchildren from Mary Ann's second marriage, many of whom remained in the Newcastle and Hunter Valley region. Margaret McGreavy died on the 9th of December 1865 at Mary Ann's home in Watt Street and was buried with her husband in Christchurch Burial Ground. She is remembered as a pioneer of Newcastle East End and the matriarch of a large, proud group of Australians.
Thank you, Mel, for this fascinating account of the life and success of Margaret McGreavy. Our team of researchers are working hard on delivering more podcasts on the lives of the convict women sent to Newcastle and the Hunter Valley. And if you're looking for more detail, the second edition of They Sent Me North, containing an expanded database and over 70 biographies, is now available for download from our online shop, www.nfhs.org.au/shop. Thanks for listening to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.
Listen for a moment last and hear me tell my tale. How o'er the seas from English shore I was condemned